and welcome to another edition of Lipstick, Lashes, and Lies. I'm going to start my show this evening by saying children shouldn't be sacrificed so you can have the life you want. You as a mother make sacrifices so your children can have the life they deserve. Remember these words because you'll understand what I mean by them at the end of this. This story is about a little boy from New Jersey who went missing many, many years ago. It took the authorities over 25 years to solve this crime. His mother, at the time of his disappearance, was just telling the law enforcement she took Timmy to the carnival. She went to a concession stand to buy a soda and turned her back for one moment, and he was gone. And Timmy was abducted by a man and woman. She saw them walk away with him. My story this evening is about a little boy. His name was Timothy William Whitley. He was born on August 6th, 1985. He was being called Timmy. This isn't going to work. I have to look down on my papers. I'm sorry. I've tried everything. It just doesn't work. Here's my papers. Everyone came to know him as Timmy from the minute he was born. Before I talk to you about Timmy, I must tell you the dynamics of his parents. Timmy's mom is Michelle Ledzinski, who was raised in South Amboy, New Jersey. Timmy's dad was George Whitley, who was from Walker, Iowa. The pair met while Michelle was very young, maybe 14 years old, and George was 15. Michelle's brother, or her older brother, owned a house on the lake and was neighbors to the Whitley family. Michelle used to spend her summers in Iowa and started dating George. It was puppy love. It was just a little thing. The relationship went on for about 3 years, and George decided he wanted to move to New Jersey to be with Michelle. When George made the move to New Jersey, he stayed with Michelle and her parents in their Sayreville, New Jersey home. After a few months, he relocated to Long Island and lived with one of his uncles, who was able to help him secure a job. While George was living in New York, and he was, corresponding with Michelle, and their little romance was still continuing. She was still at home in Sayreville. She told George she was pregnant. After meeting and discussing the situation, the couple weighed their options and decided to move back to Iowa for the duration of Michelle's pregnancy. While in Iowa, the couple really didn't settle into their own place at first. Money was tight, but their families were very supportive of them and did help them out. They were alternating residencies, some weeks at Michelle's older brother's home, and some weeks they lived with George's mom. On August 6th, 1985, Timothy made his way into this world, and he was a beautiful baby. George has stated he was 18 years old and Michelle was 17 at the time of Timmy's birth. Soon after, The couple found their own apartment, and together with Timmy, they moved in and started what should have been a sweet life. Things started to fall apart rather quickly. The couple was fighting, arguing, making each other miserable. By the time of spring 1986 rolled around, Timmy was about 8 months old. Michelle packed up. She left George and moved back to New Jersey. She told George and her family she was not happy living in Iowa. Iowa had nothing to offer her. So back to New Jersey she came with Timmy in tow. And that was the last time George ever saw his son again. On that spring day, Michelle left. That was it. George was upset by Michelle's decision. He tried to talk her out of it. No talking her out of it. He would send her money, and he would send things to Timmy to try to do the right thing. Michelle wanted none of it. She would send the checks back to him. She would send any gifts, toys, clothing that George would send for Timmy with a message: leave us alone. I want nothing to do with you. We want nothing to do with you. Please do not call us. Do not try to reach us. Leave us alone. She would mail back the checks. She'd mail back the gifts. So Timmy was raised not knowing he had a dad, father who loved him. And this was in the 80s and the 90s. Things were a lot different. It wasn't as easy to get laws to protect you, or maybe George had some problems that he didn't know what he was supposed to do or how to act upon it. And he just let it go. It's been stated from George that he did like to drink and smoke pot in the presence of Michelle. And so did she. She enjoyed her share of partying before Timmy was born. I'm not saying during her pregnancy or even after he was born, but they had their share. And some nights things got a little heavy and a little crazy. They would fight. Michelle said he hit her repeatedly. George said he slapped her one time, but he really didn't make a big deal about it. No charges were brought up against him. When Michelle came back home to New Jersey, Timmy was not a year old yet. Michelle seemed to lack morals or stability in her life. She would pack up and move on a whim. She went from living in her parents' home to packing up and moving it with various family and friends, members of her close-knit group. She was just like all over the place. And she wound up leaving New Jersey and went to Wisconsin to live with her older brother. And I believe that was the one who had the house in Iowa, but he was in Wisconsin at this point. And he allowed her and Timmy to live with him so she could get on her feet and save some money, which she did. But the years were starting to go by, and they were passing by pretty fast for her and for Timmy. I mean, she was roaming around from state to state like a gypsy. She never was in touch with George, never sent him a photograph of Timmy. He didn't even know where she was. Her older brother did mention Michelle was set on having Timmy go to a Catholic school. So while she was with him, she saved all of her money from working various jobs so she could get Timmy enrolled in a Catholic school. It turned out to be that Catholic school would be St. Mary's Elementary School in South Amboy, New Jersey. She packed up, she left Wisconsin, and came back to New Jersey just in time to get Timmy ready for kindergarten. Michelle got herself a job. She was able to afford her own apartment near his school in South Amboy, which was very close to where she grew up in Sayreville. And she seemed to be settling into the life of a single mom. By all accounts, Timmy was thriving. He was a good little boy who had friends at school and in his neighborhood. In the 90s, there were still true neighborhoods, and Sayreville was one of them. It was a middle-class area. I don't know if she rented a basement apartment in someone's, multi-leveled home. In the 90s, kids used to play outside. They would come in when the streetlights came on. The neighbors used to sit on their porches, chatting with each other, while keeping a watchful eye on the comings and goings on in the area that they lived. Everyone knew each other, and no one had a bad thing to say about Michelle or Timmy. Michelle worked, she dated, and had no problem finding boyfriends. She had her nieces, and she had some babysitters, along with family, lined up for her when she needed to go out. Now, that sounds like a responsible young woman. By now, she's maybe only 22 years old, if that. May 25th, 1991 approached, and that was Memorial Day weekend. The South Amboy, New Jersey Elks Club had their annual carnival. The traveling carnivals were big. I mean, they're still big, and everyone looked forward to them. People would come from all over for the 3-day event. They had rides for the kids, food stands, ice cream, I'm sure amusements, as well as where a kid could win a stuffed animal by throwing the ball and knock the bottles over. It was a weekend of fun and togetherness for families. People young and old attended. And I'm sure most of you have attended something like this in your lifetime. Carnival, a country fair. They're the same difference. They have everything you need. It's rolled in, set up. After 3 days, they pack up and go to another location. Michelle took Timmy to that carnival. And after putting him on a few rides and walking around, enjoying the sights, she said she wanted to get him his soda and turned her head for a second. When she turned around to give Timmy the soda, Timmy was gone. A frantic Michelle started carrying on, yelling, calling, and screaming Timmy's name, and there was no answer, and he was nowhere to be found. She was frantic. She was crying. At one point, she told the authorities she saw a male and a female walk away with Timmy, hand in hand, with Timmy in the middle. With all this commotion, the carnival shut down immediately. Law enforcement wasn't allowing anyone in, and they weren't letting anyone out. and an extensive manhunt of the grounds pursued to find little Timmy. And again, this was the 90s. So there really wasn't much by way of cameras or surveillance. There certainly wasn't cell phones. The little cameras that were set up, they weren't the best. But upon looking at what they were able to retrieve, the cops never saw any footage of Timmy being at the carnival that day. Eyewitnesses had been speaking to law enforcement, and they were telling them that lady was alone. There was no little boy with her. Michelle kept insisting that Timmy was with her and he was kidnapped. People were searching all over, and I'm not sure, but this was a park-like setting, so there was a lot of acres. And this search started pretty immediate. And it turned into days. And it turned into months. The twists and the turns that came with this saga of Timmy being abducted never added up. It never added up to the cops. It never added up to the media, the newspapers, newscasters. There was always something lacking. She was the last person to see Timmy. A neighbor stated that prior to Michelle leaving with Timmy to go to the carnival, she said she yelled at Timmy and told him not to go near the street because he could get hit by a car. She said Michelle came out. She told her she scolded him. Michelle took Timmy, got into her car, and they left. The neighbor thought she was taking him to the carnival. The searches that ensued were immense. Michelle herself participated in quite a few. The one thing, besides his little short set that he was wearing, were the Mutant Ninja Turtle sneakers. And at that time, all little boys had Mutant Ninja Turtle sneakers. I mean, that was big. You were cool. You were a cool little dude. You had those sneakers on. I remember those sneakers being a very big part of the case. Posters of Timmy were all over. His story made every major news outlet, newspaper cover, magazine covers, radio talk shows, because things like this didn't happen in New Jersey. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Hundreds of people were detained for questioning. The carnival workers themselves kept saying, "We saw her." There was no little boy that fit that description on any of the rides that Michelle said he had rode on. Suspicion started to grab law enforcement early on. They knew Michelle did something, but they didn't know what. Her stories kept changing. She was inconsistent with the details and the events that had transpired. She was acting bizarre and really was out there mentally in left field. Most importantly, Michelle showed no emotion. Not even a tear. Not even calling the police, questioning them on a daily basis to ask, have you heard anything? Any new breaks in the case? Anything? If the cops didn't call Michelle, she never reached out to them. And I know that doesn't make someone a murderer or a killer or an abductor because they show no emotion. Everyone shows a different emotion at any given time. It depends on the person. Me, I would have been in the hospital had anything ever happened to my daughters. The days turned into months, and time was passing. And Timmy's name was always in the news, partially because of the crazy things Michelle had done in the interim of Timmy being missing. She faked a kidnapping. She told authorities she was taken in a car and dropped off in another state. When they pulled the camera footage, they saw she left her car double parked and took a bus to Detroit, Michigan. Her behavior was very bizarre. Did she do this because she wanted the attention for herself? Or was it to take the attention off of Timothy? I could go on, and I could make this a multi-part segment, but I'm going to cut to the chase. She got some probation for lying to authorities, and it really didn't amount to anything because she fabricated the story about agents kidnapping her. It was all a lie. Still no Timmy. They were still looking for him, but they hadn't found him. On October 26th of 1991, a teacher was bird watching in the marshlands by Raritan Center in Edison, New Jersey. Now, for those of you that are not from New Jersey, Edison is a town, very big area, and branches off to a lot of different towns that connect to it. Sayreville and South Amboy being two of those towns where Michelle grew up and Michelle lived. While this teacher was bird watching, he came upon a Mutant Ninja Turtle sneaker. He carefully picked it up because it rang a bell in his head. He remembered about what transpired many months ago with Timmy, the sneaker that he was wearing. He packed up his belongings and he went to the Edison, New Jersey Police Department. Upon examination, they called Michelle. They needed Michelle to come in and look at the sneaker. When Michelle got there, she wasn't in a hurry to get there, but when she got there, she looked at the sneaker and she said, "It's not Timmy's. This is a different Mutant Ninja Turtle sneaker from what Timmy wore. It's not his sneaker. Nope, not his." The teacher had never heard back from law enforcement. Law enforcement had never pursued Michelle about the sneaker. The teacher was a little upset because something in his gut was ringing and nudging at him. And he felt compelled to call the local newspaper and expose what he had found. He told them, "I found this sneaker over by Raritan Center. I brought it to the Edison police station. They have never told me what the results of it were. There's nothing in the news. There's nothing on television, newspapers, magazines, radio. Can you please call them, because they're not taking my calls, and find out what's going on with this sneaker? I know it's important to that little boy who went missing." Well, the police did think they were onto something with this sneaker, and they had notified the FBI. They did go back and started to take a search and a look. to see what might be in that area. And they did find the second matching sneaker. And as they were searching, went on for a few days, they came upon skeletal remains of a little boy, of a little child, I should say. And they found a blue blanket near the remains. We never really knew about the blue blanket. So just hold that thought. Just remember that for now. Dental records positively identified the remains as Timothy Whitley. Once again, Michelle was on the front page of every newspaper, TV station. No emotion. Timmy's remains were turned over to her so she could give him a proper burial, which was performed for sweet Timothy. I could remember how distraught most of us were. I mean, I had two daughters that were just a little bit older than he was. You know, it was pretty sad. And everyone was afraid, especially in South Amboy and Perth Amboy and Edison. They thought there was a kidnapper on the loose, and everybody was just locking their doors, and just life wasn't as sweet as they knew it a year before. His family, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, cousins, they mourned his death. But Michelle, she acted very odd. She hardly cried. She just was in the moment. But again, does that make her a killer? No arrests were ever made, and the story faded for almost 24 years. Michelle moved on with her life. She went on and gave birth to 2 other sons. Her marriage and relationships did not work out. And she wound up once again being a single mom of 2 boys. And she was able to purchase a little home in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Usually on the anniversary of Timmy's abduction or of his anniversary of when they found him, the media would camp out outside of her house with, hopes of getting some sort of a little interview or a word or two in memory of Timmy. They would put a little small clip of sorts in the newspaper marking another year with no arrests. And that was it with her. While she was living her life rather quietly in Florida with her sons, things started to go on here in New Jersey, unbeknownst to Michelle. The only action she had in Florida, as I said, that would commemorate the days were the reporters. I don't think anyone of her members, the members of her family from New Jersey, even really went to his grave anymore. I mean, they didn't say that, but there was never pictures of anything going on, flowers being brought. I've researched, there was nothing. There was nothing brought to that little boy's grave. She always declined interviews. So the years just went by. Timmy would have been a man. Her boys, they were in their teens, the 2 children she went on to have. So here in New Jersey, a new DA and a cold case team started to take another look at the evidence they had stored away all of these years. So let's talk about the evidence that they had. They had a blanket. It wasn't a throw blanket. It wasn't a baby's blanket. The day Timmy went missing, it was a very hot day on that Memorial Day weekend. Why would he have had a blanket next to his remains? It wasn't something that you, like a little baby has in their carriage that they hold on to, a security blanket. This was a blanket that was the size of maybe a twin bed that could be used on a couch. It was just larger than something that a little kid would have. And it was heavy. It was a heavier grade of wool. So as the evidence started to pile up and they started to look at the crime scene pictures, they were re-interviewing family members, babysitters, and those who knew Michelle. They went back to her apartment, and one of her nieces who spoke with them had some pictures. And in those pictures of Timmy as a little boy, there was that blue blanket. And it was a light bulb went off to the DA's in his mind. He said, that blue blanket, that's the blanket. They knew that they needed to get a grand jury in place to present some of this evidence because they just couldn't go and arrest Michelle on what they had. On August 6th, 2014, which would have been Timmy's 29th birthday, with a sealed indictment from the grand jury, law enforcement arrested Michelle Ledzinski at her Port St. Lucie, Florida home. She was extradited back to New Jersey to face a murder trial. She happened to be working for attorneys out in Florida who decided, we have to help this girl. They don't have enough evidence on her to bring her up on murder charges. So one of the attorneys from the firm she worked for flew out here with her pro bono because he was going to help Michelle go free because New Jersey authorities are crazy. They've got the wrong person. She was extradited back to New Jersey to face murder trial. The Honorable Dennis Nieves was the judge assigned to the case. There were a lot of things from Michelle's past he would not allow into the trial so she could get a fair and impartial trial. The kidnapping hoax was not allowed, as well as a few other brushes with the law that Michelle had along the way. In my honest opinion, he was a very fair judge from all accounts that I read. And he knew he had one shot at this 29 years later, and he wasn't going to fail. He wasn't going to let anybody come in and say, Michelle didn't get a fair trial. Not in his courtroom and not on his watch. Her failed polygraph tests were not allowed in because they're inadmissible in New Jersey. You cannot bring them into the court of law. And the DA was not giving up this time, as was the cold case investigators. They knew they had a lot more than was noted so many years ago. So up to this point, what do we have? We have a lot of different stories and accounts for the day Timmy went missing. We have no proof he ever attended the carnival. Eyewitnesses said they saw Michelle alone that day at the carnival. We have a pair of Ninja Turtle sneakers Michelle denied belonged to Timmy. We have a blue blanket that looked like the one he had. They had skeletal remains that have been buried. They had autopsy photos that did not give any cause of death. No DNA, no blood or bodily fluids. The blanket was truly the most important piece of evidence that they had. Michelle's niece, who after all those years was still broken up, was called in. And she was the one who ultimately nailed Michelle. Not only with her testimony, she had the pictures from those photo albums that we used to have back in the day of Michelle's apartment and little Timmy sitting on the couch. And guess what was behind him? Yes, the blanket. Yes, the evidence that was in court was a very dirty, filthy blanket. The elements had gotten to it, but it was the same pattern as the blanket that was on the couch or on his bed. It was his blanket, and niece said it never left the apartment. But they never found it. When they went to search her apartment, there was no blanket in the apartment. Her trial started on March 16th, 2016, and ended on May 18th, 2016, with a guilty verdict. May 18th was 1 week shy of Timmy's 25th anniversary of his death. Imagine the irony. Michelle was sentenced to 30 years in jail without the possibility of parole. She must complete the entire sentence. And by the time she gets out, she will be 79 or 80 years old. I believe her family members took her boys in, the boys that she left in Florida, because they were minors and they didn't have fathers. So it was her family that took them in, and I would imagine they're in college now. And she is housed at the same women's prison here in New Jersey that houses Melanie McGuire, the one who killed her husband. All of Michelle's appeals were heard. Even the state Supreme Court heard her case and agreed with the jury. There was enough evidence to convince a jury Michelle Ledzinski was guilty of murder. Well, we wanted to know why she would want to get rid of Timmy. It was never answered. The only reasons that were brought up, and I found this out researching, that were ever mentioned on the witness stand were by his teachers, some of his relatives, the niece. She said that Timmy started to suffer with some health issues. Nothing very serious, but his teeth started to bother him. His stomach was always hurting him. He was always crying and complaining of little aches and pains. And in a short span of time, it seemed like Michelle was just losing her patience. But where was the family? Where were the grandparents? Didn't they hear, these little cries for help? It didn't seem as if anyone could ever take charge of Timmy or care for him, because I guess Michelle knew best, and she was his mother. And this is so tragic and sad. So after all those years, Timmy would be about 33 now. And finally, there was justice for Timothy William Whitley. Rest easy, little boy. because New Jersey loves you and you will never be forgotten. And hope you all enjoyed this segment. And this one kind of took the life out of me, especially when there's children involved. And she's right where she deserves to be. And I just wonder if she thought about Timmy all those years. So stay safe and well, everyone. And thank you for joining me this evening. Good night.